The restaurant was filled with warm light and the hum of laughter. It was one of those evenings when everything seemed perfect for the guests. Music played softly from hidden speakers, silverware clinked gently, and the smell of roasted food floated through the air. Everyone looked happy. Everyone, except the young woman standing quietly near the kitchen door holding a tray of empty glasses. She worked there almost every night, moving from table to table with a polite smile that rarely reached her eyes. In the corner of the room stood a grand piano, shining under the lights. No one had touched it in months. It was mostly there for decoration, a symbol of elegance more than an instrument meant for sound. But every time she passed by it, her eyes paused. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, a quiet pull like the piano was calling out to her. That night, a charity dinner was being held. The guests were well-dressed, laughing and talking loudly as if every word needed to be heard. The piano stood close to one of the larger tables, and one of the guests noticed the young woman staring at it again. He nudged his friend and whispered something, smirking. Then he called out loudly enough for others to hear. "Hey, you keep looking at that piano. You thinking of playing us a song?" The people around him laughed. Even a few waiters chuckled quietly, not out of cruelty but from the pressure of the moment. She froze, caught in their gaze, her cheeks turning pink. She didn't say anything, just shook her head and looked down. But the laughter only grew louder. "Come on, don't be shy," another voice shouted. "We could use some entertainment." The manager, trying to keep things light, walked over and said jokingly, "She probably knows a tune or two. Go ahead, surprise us." The teasing tone in his voice made everyone laugh again. She forced a small smile, trying to move away, but something inside her stopped her steps. Maybe it was pride, maybe pain, or maybe she was just tired of being the quiet one in the background. She looked at the piano one more time. The keys gleamed like they were waiting. The laughter around her grew softer, turning into murmurs of disbelief as she slowly walked toward it. Every step felt heavier than the last. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She wasn't sure why she was doing it. Maybe to prove something, maybe to feel something. The people who had mocked her leaned back in their chairs, watching with amusement. One of them even pulled out a phone to record. To them it was just a joke, a harmless moment of fun. To her it was something else. A moment she hadn't prepared for but couldn't walk away from. She pulled the bench slightly forward and sat down. Her hands trembled. The polished wood under her fingers felt strange, familiar, and distant all at once. The piano was well tuned. Someone must have taken care of it, even if it hadn't been played. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy surface above the keys. For a long moment she just sat there, listening to the sound of people whispering, giggling, and waiting for her to fail. A small group at one of the tables began to clap mockingly, cheering her on like she was part of some game. Her throat tightened. She could have stood up and walked away, but she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a few seconds, the world around her disappeared. It was just her, the piano, and the silence between them. When her fingers finally pressed the first key, everything changed. The note that came out wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a whisper of something pure. The laughter faded instantly. Another note followed, then another, each one stronger, clearer, and filled with emotion that words couldn't touch. Her hands began to move naturally, no longer trembling. The melody that flowed from the piano was simple but beautiful. It wasn't just sound, it was her story, hidden in each key. People turned their heads. Forks stopped clinking. Waiters paused mid-step. The man who had first teased her sat back slowly, his smirk fading. She didn't look up. She was somewhere else now, somewhere years away. Back when she was a child, sitting beside her father as he taught her how to find the right keys on a broken old piano. He used to say, "You don't play music with your hands, you play it with your heart." Those words echoed in her mind now, guiding her fingers. The melody grew deeper, richer. It rose and fell like a conversation between her and the piano, between her past and her present. The sound filled the restaurant, reaching every corner. The people who had laughed earlier sat in silence. Some leaned forward completely still, afraid to make a sound that might break the spell. Her emotions poured out in the rhythm, the struggles, the quiet dreams, the years she had stopped believing she was good enough. Each note carried a piece of that life she had kept hidden while cleaning tables and serving plates. She didn't notice that the manager had stopped pretending to work, or that the waiters were standing by the door watching her. When she finally let her fingers rest, the last note lingered in the air like a memory refusing to fade. The silence that followed was heavy but soft, filled with something unspoken. No one moved. Then slowly someone started to clap. Another joined. And within seconds the entire room was applauding. Not the loud, careless kind of clapping meant for fun, but the kind that comes from genuine awe. Her eyes opened. For the first time that night she truly looked at them, the people who had laughed at her just minutes ago. Some were smiling, others seemed unsure how to react, and a few even looked guilty. She didn't need to say anything. The music had said everything for her. The manager stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I didn't know you could play like that," he said quietly. She smiled a little, not out of pride but relief. She didn't respond. She just stood, gave a polite nod, and walked back toward the kitchen. Her heart was still beating fast, but in a different way this time. It wasn't from fear. It was from something lighter, a feeling she hadn't known in years. Behind her, people kept clapping. Some whispered to each other, asking who she was. Others pulled out their phones, realizing too late they had just witnessed something special. A moment that began with laughter had ended in silence, then admiration. In the kitchen, she placed her tray on the counter and took a deep breath. One of her co-workers looked at her in surprise. "Was that really you playing out there?" She nodded shyly. He shook his head in disbelief. "You just made everyone stop talking," he said with a small laugh. "That's not easy in this place." She smiled again, this time genuinely. Maybe for the first time in a long time, for her it wasn't about applause or proving a point. It was about remembering who she was, who she used to be before life pushed her dreams aside. That one song had given her something back. Not fame, not money, but peace. Out in the dining area, the piano stood quietly once more, but it didn't seem like a decoration anymore. It had become part of the story, part of her. The guests continued their meals, still talking about the young woman who played like she carried a lifetime in her hands. None of them would forget that moment soon, and as she leaned against the counter in the back, still hearing the faint echo of her melody in her mind, she realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes it takes only one note, one single, honest note, to turn laughter into silence and silence into understanding. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of her alarm clock buzzing on the small table beside her bed. The room was quiet except for that sound. She lived in a small apartment with old walls that creaked when the wind passed through. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the cafe downstairs. For a few seconds, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what had happened the night before. The music, the faces, the silence afterward. It all felt unreal. She had played without planning to. She hadn't practiced for months, maybe even years. And yet the moment her fingers touched the keys, it was as if something inside her had woken up. The memory of it made her heart beat faster, a strange mix of fear and joy. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from one of her co-workers. "You won't believe it. Someone posted your piano video online last night." "It's everywhere." She blinked in confusion. Her video? She sat up, grabbed the phone, and opened the link her coworker sent. There she was, sitting at the restaurant's piano, her hands moving across the keys. The caption read, "Waitress silences the crowd with her piano playing." She watched the clip, her chest tightening. The comments were pouring in. People were amazed, calling her performance emotional and unexpected. Some asked who she was, where she learned to play. Others shared the video with words like, "This gave me chills," and "You never know someone's story." She scrolled through them slowly, feeling a mix of disbelief and nervousness. The attention made her uneasy, but it also stirred something in her heart, a small spark she thought had long gone out. When she arrived at the restaurant later that day, the air felt different. Her coworkers looked at her with a new kind of curiosity. The manager, who had laughed the night before, now greeted her carefully, almost respectfully. "That was something last night," he said, smiling. "You surprised everyone." She didn't know what to say. "I didn't mean to make a scene," she replied quietly. "Well," he said, rubbing his neck, "you did more than that. We had people calling this morning asking who you are. That video's got, what, 50,000 views already?" Her eyes widened. 50,000? He nodded. "You might want to check your phone again. You're famous now." The word famous didn't sit comfortably with her. She wasn't used to attention. She liked being invisible. Or at least she had convinced herself she did. Now everyone was looking at her differently. Even some of the same guests who had laughed at her were back again that day, hoping she might play once more. Throughout the shift, people kept asking questions. Where did you learn to play? How long have you been performing? Are you a professional pianist? She smiled politely and gave short answers, not wanting to turn her job into a story. But deep inside, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something important had changed. Later that evening, while cleaning a table near the piano, she ran her fingers lightly over the keys. A soft note escaped, and a few guests turned their heads, waiting. She quickly pulled her hand back, shaking her head. She wasn't ready to do it again, not yet. Playing that night had come from a place of emotion, not performance. It wasn't something she could just repeat on command. When the restaurant closed, she stayed a little longer, wiping down the counters while everyone else left. The lights were dim, and only the glow from the sign outside lit the room. She sat down at the piano again, this time alone. Her fingers moved slowly, testing the sound. She began to play a quiet tune, something soft, unfinished. It wasn't for anyone else. It was just for her. As she played, her thoughts drifted back to her past. She remembered her father's voice, the lessons he gave her in their small house years ago. He had believed in her talent, but life had other plans. After he passed away, she had to find work, and music became something she carried quietly in her heart, never spoken of, never shared. The restaurant job was supposed to be temporary, but time slipped away and so did her dream. When she finished playing, she sighed. The silence that followed was both comforting and heavy. She didn't notice that someone had been standing near the door watching. That was beautiful, a voice said softly. She turned, startled. It was one of the regular customers, an older woman who always sat near the window. The woman smiled kindly. You have a gift, my dear. Don't hide it, the young woman didn't know what to say. She nodded politely and murmured, Thank you. The woman continued, My son works with a local music foundation. They often host events to support young musicians. You should meet him. I think he'd love to hear you play. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't ready for anything like that. But the woman's gentle eyes made her pause. Maybe, she said quietly. Over the next few days, the video continued to spread. More and more people came to the restaurant asking about her. Journalists called. Local news wanted an interview, but she avoided all of it. She wasn't interested in fame or cameras. All she wanted was to play again, on her own terms. That weekend, she met the older woman's son, who turned out to be a kind man with a deep love for music. He listened to her story with genuine interest. We have an open night next month, he said. It's not a big show, just a gathering of musicians who share their work. No pressure, no crowd expecting perfection, just people who love music. You should come, she hesitated. I don't know if I can. You already can, he replied with a smile. You just need to believe it. That night, back in her apartment, she sat by the small window with a cup of tea, looking out at the quiet street below. The city lights flickered softly, and she thought about everything that had happened in just a few days. Her life hadn't changed much on the surface. She still worked the same job, lived in the same place, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she was thinking about music again, not just as a memory, but as something alive. She found her old notebook, the one she used to keep beside her piano at home. The pages were yellowed, filled with half-written pieces and scattered notes. She ran her fingers across them and smiled. It felt like finding a part of herself she thought she'd lost. Over the next few weeks, she began practicing again after work. Sometimes she stayed late at the restaurant, playing softly when no one was around. Other times, she used the small keyboard she had kept stored under her bed for years. Her hands were slow at first, but the music started to return. Not perfectly, but honestly. One night, while she was playing, she realized she wasn't thinking about being recorded or judged. She was simply lost in the music, the same way she used to be when her father listened quietly beside her. She smiled to herself. The piano, she thought, had always been waiting. She had just needed the courage to return. The day of the open night arrived faster than she expected. She stood backstage, her hands cold, her heart racing. The small hall was filled with people who had come to listen, not mock. Still, the fear was there, the same fear she had felt at the restaurant that night. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Fear meant she cared. Fear meant she was alive. When her turn came, she walked out slowly and sat down at the piano. The lights were soft, the crowd quiet. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first note felt familiar, warm and true. It spread through the room like light. And just like before, the world around her disappeared. Her melody told her story without words, a story of struggle, loss, rediscovery, and hope. People listened, completely still. Some smiled. Some closed their eyes. Some wiped away tears. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment before the applause began. But this time it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the feeling in her heart, the quiet joy of finally being herself again. As she walked off the stage, the man from the foundation met her with a wide smile. "See," he said gently. "I told you." She laughed softly, the sound light and free. For the first time in a long time, she believed it too. After that small performance at the open night, her life began to feel different, though she didn't quite understand how. The next morning when she woke up, there was a calmness in her heart that hadn't been there before. She wasn't chasing fame or trying to prove anyone wrong. She was simply doing something that made her feel alive again. The video from the restaurant was still spreading online. People kept sharing it, adding kind words and asking where she came from. Some said her music had brought them to tears. Others said it reminded them of something they'd lost long ago. She read a few of the messages late at night, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying quietly. It was strange to think that her simple act, playing a piano she didn't even own, had touched so many strangers. Days passed and she continued working at the restaurant. The piano still stood in the corner, but now it carried a story with it. Guests often asked her to play again, but she usually smiled and said softly, "Maybe later." She didn't want to turn her music into a performance for attention. It was something personal, something she needed to keep pure. Still, she couldn't ignore how much she missed playing. The rhythm of the keys had become a part of her again. So after work each night, she stayed behind when the lights dimmed and everyone left. She would sit at the piano, close her eyes, and let her fingers move gently across the keys. The melodies she played were soft and full of emotion, like secret conversations between her and the piano. One evening, as she played, she noticed someone standing near the door. It was the man from the Music Foundation, the same one who had invited her to the open night. He smiled quietly and said, "I was hoping I'd find you here." She looked surprised, almost shy. He continued, "We're organizing a small concert next month. It's for young artists who've been through tough times but found healing in music. You'd fit perfectly." She hesitated, her fingers still resting on the keys. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," she said honestly. "I'm not a professional. I just play because it helps me feel—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Free," he nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly why you should do it. Music like yours doesn't come from training. It comes from the heart. That's what people need to hear." His words stayed with her long after he left. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the concert, about standing on a real stage playing for people who were there to listen, not to laugh. The thought scared her, but it also excited her in a way she hadn't felt in years. The next day she called him and said quietly, "I'll do it." From that day on, she practiced every night after work. The restaurant manager noticed and even encouraged her. "You've brought more people here than any advertisement," he said with a grin. "You're good for business and for the soul." She laughed softly but said nothing. Inside she knew it wasn't about business. It was about finding herself again. Her practice sessions became her escape. She played everything she could remember from her childhood. Old songs her father taught her, pieces she had once written but never finished, and new melodies that came from deep inside. Each time she played, the fear she once carried grew smaller, replaced by quiet confidence. She began to feel like herself again, the girl who once dreamed of music before the world convinced her to stop. The day of the concert arrived sooner than she expected. She stood backstage again, just like at the open night, but this time there were more people, more lights, and more nerves. The air buzzed with excitement. Musicians tuned their instruments and whispered final thoughts to themselves. She sat quietly in a corner, her hands resting on her lap, trying to calm her racing heart. When her turn came, The host introduced her as the woman whose piano performance moved millions online. She blushed slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. As she walked out, the crowd greeted her with warm applause. She could feel the kindness in their faces. No one here was laughing. They were waiting to listen. She sat at the piano and took a slow breath. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and thought of her father, the way he used to smile when she played, the way he'd tap his finger along with the rhythm. She whispered quietly under her breath, "This one's for you." Then she began. The melody that flowed from her hands was tender and full of emotion. It started slow, like a memory unfolding, then grew stronger, richer, as if each note carried a piece of her story. She didn't need to think about what came next. Her heart guided her fingers. The music filled the hall, wrapping everyone in its warmth. Some people leaned forward, others closed their eyes. There was no sound except for her playing. As she reached the middle of her piece, something unexpected happened. The lights dimmed slightly and the hall seemed to hold its breath. Her playing grew more intense, filled with both sadness and hope. It was as if she was telling her entire life story through sound. The laughter, the loss, the loneliness, and the courage to stand again. When the final note faded, silence filled the room. Then slowly applause began. Soft at first, then stronger and stronger until the whole hall was clapping. She looked up, her eyes wide, her chest rising with deep breaths. She had done it. The sound of their applause wasn't just appreciation, it was understanding. They didn't see her as a waitress or a viral video. They saw her as a musician, a person who had something real to share. After the concert, people came up to her, thanking her, telling her how much her music had touched them. One woman said, "I lost my husband last year. Tonight was the first time I felt peace. Thank you." Her eyes filled with tears as she replied softly, "That means more to me than you know." The man from the foundation smiled proudly. "You belong up there," he said. "You remind people what music is really for." She didn't know how to respond. She simply smiled, her heart full. As she packed up to leave, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had once held her back was gone, replaced by quiet strength. When she returned to the restaurant the next day, things felt different, even though everything looked the same. The same tables, the same lights, the same piano in the corner, but she had changed. The manager greeted her with a big smile. "You're famous now," he joked. "We might have to start charging people just to hear you practice." She laughed softly and shook her head. "Let's not do that," she said. "I just want to play." From that day on, she played for the guests every evening, not for attention, but because it brought joy. People came not just to eat, but to listen. The laughter that once filled the room was replaced by gentle applause and quiet smiles. And every time she played, she remembered where it all began, the night when everyone had mocked her, and one note had changed everything. As weeks turned into months, she received invitations to play at other events, small concerts, even interviews. But she never let it go to her head. She still worked at the restaurant, still wiped down tables, still helped her coworkers. Music was no longer a dream she had lost, it was now part of her everyday life. Sometimes, when she was alone at the piano after hours, she would look at her reflection in the glossy surface of the instrument and smile. She saw a person who had once been invisible, now glowing quietly from within, not because of fame, but because she had found her voice again. And deep down she knew something simple and true, that the night people laughed at her wasn't the worst moment of her life. It was the moment that gave her a second chance to live the life she was meant to have. As the months went by, her life began to take on a rhythm she had never imagined before. Every evening she played at the restaurant, and each night more people came to listen. Some guests were locals who had heard her story. Others traveled from nearby towns just to see the woman whose piano had silenced a room. But despite the growing attention, she stayed humble. She still wiped tables, served food, and helped her coworkers as always. She didn't see herself as special. She simply played because she loved it. The manager eventually set up a small corner for her, adding soft lighting and a sign that read, "Live piano every evening." It wasn't a grand stage, but to her, it felt enough. She was finally doing what she loved without pretending to be anyone else. And yet deep down a quiet thought began to stir in her heart. Could this lead to something more? She didn't dream of fame, but she wanted to share her music beyond those walls. One evening, While she was playing a gentle tune after dinner, a man sitting near the front listened quietly, barely touching his meal. He was older, dressed simply, but there was something serious about his expression. When she finished, he clapped slowly and came over. "That was beautiful," he said softly. "I haven't heard music like that in a long time." She smiled politely as she did with everyone who complimented her. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad you liked it." The man handed her a card. "I work with a small recording studio," he said. "We help independent musicians record their work. I think your sound deserves to be heard." She stared at the card for a moment, unsure what to say. Recording music had never crossed her mind. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I'm not a professional," he smiled. "Professional or not, what you play comes from the heart. That's what people remember. If you ever want to record something, call me." Then he left, leaving the card on the piano. That night she stared at it for a long time. She felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Part of her wanted to call right away. Another part whispered, "You're not ready." She placed the card in her bag and told herself she'd think about it later. Days turned into weeks. The card stayed in her bag untouched. But every night as she played, she thought about what it might be like to record her own music. Not for fame, not for money. Just to have something lasting. Something that would live even after she stopped playing. One evening, after the restaurant closed, she finally called the number. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. The man remembered her immediately. "I'm glad you called," he said warmly. "Come by the studio this weekend. Bring whatever piece feels closest to your heart." That Saturday, she stood outside the small recording studio, her hands cold despite the warm air. It wasn't fancy, just a simple space with a few instruments, microphones, and soundproof walls. But it felt sacred, like a place where dreams were preserved. The man greeted her kindly and introduced her to a few others who worked there. They made her feel comfortable right away. "Just play like you always do," he said. "Forget the equipment. Pretend you're back at the restaurant." She nodded and sat at the piano. When she began to play, something inside her shifted again. The melody filled the room, soft and powerful. It wasn't a song she had written. It was something she had felt for years but never shared. Every note carried emotion, as if she were telling her story without a single word. When she finished, there was silence in the studio. The man looked at her, visibly moved. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "You don't just play. You speak through the music." She blushed slightly, unsure how to respond. "I just play what I feel," she said softly. They recorded a few more pieces that day, each one raw and full of emotion. She didn't worry about mistakes. She simply let her heart guide her fingers. By the time she left the studio, the sun was setting, and the world outside felt peaceful. She had no idea what would come from it, but she knew she had done something meaningful. A week later, the man called her. "We put one of your recordings online," he said. "I hope you don't mind." The response has been amazing. Her heart skipped. "Really?" "Yes," he said, excitement in his voice. "People are connecting with it. They say it feels alive, like it's telling a story they can't put into words." She didn't know what to say. Part of her felt overwhelmed, but another part felt grateful. She never wanted to be famous, but knowing her music touched people made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. Weeks passed, and her recordings continued to spread. She received messages from strangers across the world, people thanking her for bringing peace into their lives. Some said her music helped them through sleepless nights or moments of sadness. Others shared that it reminded them of their own forgotten dreams. At the restaurant, things were changing too. More people came each night, not to mock or gossip, but to listen. The laughter that once filled the room had turned into quiet appreciation. The piano that used to gather dust now carried warmth and life. But not everything was easy. The attention sometimes became too much. Reporters started visiting, asking for interviews, wanting to know her story. She didn't like talking about herself. The idea of being watched made her nervous. One night, after a long day, she sat alone at the piano, feeling the weight of it all. She pressed one key softly, then another, until a melody began to form. Slow, calm, and full of emotion. The music reminded her why she had started in the first place. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for the part of her that needed to feel alive, to heal, to express what words couldn't say. One evening, she received a letter from a music foundation. They wanted to invite her to perform at a national event, a concert for musicians who had inspired others with their stories. The invitation felt unreal. She read it several times before believing it was real. She wasn't sure if she should accept. The thought of standing before such a large audience scared her. But then she remembered how far she had come, from being laughed at to being heard. Maybe it was time to take another step. When the night of the event came, she stood backstage, her hands trembling, just like they had that first night in the restaurant. She looked at the grand piano waiting for her under the lights. The hall was filled with people, musicians, listeners, strangers who had found comfort in her music. The announcer called her name. She took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were bright and the room felt huge, but when she sat down, everything went quiet. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and let the first note fill the air. It was the same feeling as that very first time, the night everyone had mocked her, when one sound had changed everything. Only now there was no laughter, only silence waiting for her story. She played like she was speaking to every person in the room, to every person who had ever been doubted, ignored, or underestimated. Her music rose and fell like waves filled with both sadness and strength. The audience listened, still and captivated. The sound seemed to carry beyond the walls, beyond the city, into the hearts of those who needed it. When the final note faded, the hall erupted in applause. People stood clapping and cheering, some with tears in their eyes. She sat quietly for a moment, taking it all in. Then she stood, bowed gently and smiled, the same simple, humble smile she had always worn. That night she didn't think about fame or success. She thought about how one small moment of courage, sitting at that restaurant piano while people laughed, had led her here. It reminded her that sometimes the world only sees your worth when you stop hiding it. As she walked off the stage, someone backstage said softly, "You've just made history tonight." But she shook her head gently and said, "No, I just played from my heart, and that was the truth." Her story wasn't about being discovered, it was about rediscovering herself. The night of the concert stayed in her mind for a long time. Even after the applause faded and the lights went out, the feeling stayed with her. It wasn't about being recognized or being praised. It was about how far she had come from the person everyone once laughed at. She went home that night and sat quietly by her window. The city lights twinkled below, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace with herself. In the following weeks, her life changed in ways she never expected. People began inviting her to perform at different events. Some were small gatherings, others were in big halls. But no matter where she played, she always carried the same sense of humility. She didn't dress like a star or speak like one. She still smiled the same way, soft and shy, and always thanked people for listening. At one event, a young girl came up to her after the performance. She was holding her mother's hand and looked nervous. "I want to learn to play like you," the girl said softly. "But my friends say I can't. They laugh at me." The woman bent down so she was eye level with the child. "When I first played," she said gently, "people laughed at me too. But you know what? Their laughter can't touch your music. If you play from your heart one day, they'll stop laughing and start listening." The little girl smiled and her mother's eyes filled with tears. That moment stayed with her. She realized that what she was doing wasn't just music, it was hope. Each note she played told someone somewhere that they could keep going no matter what people said. But fame, even gentle fame, can be exhausting. She began to feel the pressure of it all. People expected her to always be calm, always perfect. Some wanted her to change her style, to play more upbeat commercial tunes. They said it would make her more successful. But every time she tried, it didn't feel right. Her hands would pause, her heart wouldn't follow. The music lost its soul, so she decided to take a break. She told the manager of the restaurant she needed time away. She didn't want to lose herself in the noise. She packed a small bag and went to a quiet village near the hills, a place where the wind carried the smell of pine and rain, and the nights were filled with the sound of crickets. There she stayed in a small cottage. There was an old piano in the corner, slightly out of tune, but it didn't matter. She spent her mornings walking through the woods and her evenings sitting by the piano, playing softly. The music she made there was different, peaceful, slow, and full of reflection. During one of her walks, she met an old man sitting on a bench overlooking the valley. He looked like he had been there for years, watching the same view. They started talking. He asked her what brought her to the hills, and she told him she played the piano. "Ah, music," he said with a smile. "It's the only language that never grows old." They talked for hours about lifetime and how people often rush so much they forget to feel. He told her how he used to paint but stopped when no one cared for his work. "I thought it didn't matter anymore," he said. "But sometimes I still see colors when the sun sets, and it reminds me why I started." His words stayed with her. That evening, she sat by the piano and began composing a new piece. It was simple, just a few notes, but each one carried meaning. It was about finding peace after chaos, about forgiving yourself for the times you gave up. As days turned into weeks, she filled the quiet nights with melodies. Some were happy, some were sad, but all were honest. She didn't record them or share them online. They were hers alone. She felt free again. One morning, she received a letter at the cottage. It was from the recording studio manager. He wrote, "People are still asking about you. They wonder when you'll play again. But don't rush. Your music is worth waiting for." She smiled and put the letter away. She didn't feel the need to hurry. She understood now that her journey wasn't about keeping up with others. It was about staying true to herself. Months later, when she finally returned to the city, the restaurant had changed. There were new faces, new lights, but the old piano was still there, waiting. The manager ran up to her with excitement. "You're back," he said. "Everyone has been asking when you'll play again." She laughed softly. "Then maybe tonight," she said. That evening, the restaurant was full. Some people had no idea who she was. Others had been waiting for her return. When she sat at the piano, a hush fell over the room. It felt like the first night all over again. But this time, there was no fear. She took a deep breath and began to play the new piece she had written in the hills. It started softly like a whisper, then grew with gentle strength. The notes rose and fell like waves, full of emotion. The room grew still. Even the waiters stopped to listen. It was as if the world had paused for a few minutes to breathe. When she finished, there was silence again. Soft, deep silence, before the applause began. But it wasn't the loud kind that fills the air. It was the warm kind, the kind that comes from people who truly feel something. After the crowd left, she stayed behind, her fingers resting on the keys. The manager approached her. "You know," he said, smiling, "you've changed this place. People come here not just for the food anymore. They come because your music reminds them of something real." She looked at him quietly. "It's not my music," she said. "It's everyone's. I just play what's already inside them." Years passed, but her story never faded. She didn't become a celebrity or fill stadiums. Instead, she became a quiet legend, a symbol of resilience and heart. Her recordings continued to spread, reaching people she would never meet. Some called her music healing. Others called it timeless. One day, she was invited to a school where children were learning to play piano. She walked into the small hall and saw rows of students, their eyes bright with curiosity. When she sat at the old upright piano in the corner, the room went silent. She played a simple tune, one that even beginners could follow. Then she looked up and said, "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. Don't play to impress, play to express." Afterward, one of the teachers asked her what kept her going all those years ago, when everyone mocked her. She thought for a moment, then said, "Because I knew the piano wasn't laughing at me. It was waiting for me to listen." That answer became something people remembered. It was shared, written, quoted. But to her, it was just the truth. As the years went by, she continued to play quietly wherever she went. Sometimes at small community events, sometimes just in her own home. Her hands grew older, slower, but the feeling never faded. The music still came naturally, like breathing. On her last performance at a quiet charity gathering, she played the same piece she had played on that first night in the restaurant, the one that had silenced a room full of laughter. When she finished, she smiled faintly and whispered, "Every story begins with one note." The people in the audience stood and clapped, not because she was famous, but because they felt something they couldn't put into words. And in that moment, it was clear. She had never needed to prove anything to the world. She had already won, the day she chose to play despite the laughter. Her story became one told by others, of a woman who turned mockery into melody, who taught the world that even the quietest voices can change everything when they find the courage to be heard.